It's breaking sword news! Okay, so this is hot off the presses news. This was brought to my attention by our Nihonto correspondent Gunsen History, which you can find online. He is always great at sharing important information about Japanese swords and a great friend of the channel. So there's a new article that's come out that seems to be hosted by the site for Touken World, which is a great resource for looking at very old and very well-preserved Japanese blades. This seems to be released by, I believe the author's name is Mei Haku. Forgive me if that is not the actual author. That seems to be the only attribution I can see. So I'm using machine translation, and it's not perfect, so I'm doing the best I can with the English version that I have. Previously, we had been comparing longsword length to daito length, especially in the pre-Edo period swords, and we looked between the two of them, and we decided that long swords mostly have a distribution length where the blade length is longer than daito, but there is some overlap. So if the Venn diagram is like this, there is overlap between the two, and it really depends on the time frame. This article addresses a question only looking at Japanese swords, and it's distinguishing between uchigatana and tachi. So katana, as we think of from the Edo period onward, and the older style of tachi that preceded it. And that's a question that comes up all the time. Are tachi bigger than katana? Well, someone has gone and taken the time to look at a whole bunch of swords. Let's see what the data says. So the writer for the Touken World here asks which is longer, tachi or uchigatana. And everyone says that the tachi is longer. Everyone addresses the author, assuming that the tachi is longer, and they point out that there are exceptionally long examples of katana. And again, a katana will have the mei written on the nakago, the tang, in a position where, when it's viewed, it is viewed from the side that is shown where it's worn edge up. If you try and wear it edge facing down like a tachi, the mei will be hidden when it's on your when it's on your belt. So you can just tell we're not going to be trying to determine which is which based on just size. In this case, they're looking at the blade, seeing how the smith signed the blade, and using that, at least in part, to determine if it was intended to be a tachi or an uchigatana. And then they're segregating them based on that and measuring their length. So what information does this study do? They managed to collect a huge amount of information across a pretty large chunk of swords. They looked at 74 tachi and 226 uchigatana. These are ubu, so these are swords that have not been shortened. And so from that data, they haven't provided the actual data in the raw, but they have given us a couple summary statistics and summary graphs. Now, before we look at them, let's talk about how this, what are our takeaways. The sensitivity for this is pretty good. It's going to, the criteria for entering into it is going to capture pretty much anything, because as we discussed before, Touken World has a huge library of swords from all points in time. They have a good way of being able to tell, in most cases, if a sword is one type or another. So they're likely to have things from all points in sword history. The specificity is not great, because in this case, the way that they are presenting the data, we don't really know which swords come from which points in time. So we're not going to be able to see trends over time to be able to tell if this is an Edo phenomenon or a Koto phenomenon or something for newer swords, older swords, or what have you. They're just saying they're looking at their entire collection, presumably, or perhaps only just the ubu swords, the swords that are untouched. What about the generalizability? What are we going to be able to interpret from these findings? Again, that's pretty low, because one, we do not know from when these swords are coming, and two, these are only uncut swords, and so there's always going to be some form of bias when you have these swords that, for whatever reason, were never touched. So these are presumably very, very nice swords, and swords that survived many of the sword culls, swords that had been damaged in use or in battle and later shortened, or swords that have just been destroyed over time and used up. So for whatever reason, over hundreds of years, these are the ones that have survived and are still in one piece. That means that this is not necessarily the representative katana of your average everyday walking around ashiguro or samurai who's walking the streets of the city. These are the swords that we have, and they're the best that we can use to make assumptions from, but they shouldn't be used to assume that this is exactly what everyone was using in the past. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the data actually says. So the first thing that they do is they present this chart that shows the swords that are placed in order of lengths of Nagasa in length, starting from the longest and going to the shortest. And they're color-coded, so you can see the uchigatana in orange and the tachi in blue. And there's a little bit of clustering going on where more of the tachi are in the longer end, and fewer are in the shorter end. But there are tachi down here in the shortest quartile, and there are uchigatana up here in the longest quartile. So even looking at it like this, you can see that if we just take the tachi, for example, since the tachi are making up approximately a quarter of the sample, they are distributed across the entire length that we have represented here. They're a little bit more biased on the longer end, but they are represented at each of the size ranges that we have in the sample size that they've looked at. And that's reflected when we go down to the next way that it was distributed. So you have the chart here, the orange again representing the uchigatana, and then the blue line representing the tachi. Down here it's the same. So this character here represents tachi, and this character down here represents uchigatana. And it's showing by each roughly 3 centimeter increment. So they have little buckets that they've created where they've broken down groups, and they show what percentage of each group the swords make up. They explicitly said that they only had a handful of swords that were over 81 centimeters, so they've omitted them because it would ruin how the graph was represented. Because they have more than 200 uchigatana, you're starting to get a little bit of a normalized distribution. So you're starting to look at the bell curve a little bit there, with a mean around the 69 to 72 centimeter Nagasa. This is consistent with other types of studies that I've seen. And it kind of makes sense. So one of the edicts that we've seen in the Edo period, there was a limitation on the size that daito could be, and one of them is the Edo Castle daito length edict, and that was 2 shaku, 3 sun, which comes out to 69.7 centimeters, or about 70 centimeters. And so, unsurprisingly, a bunch of katana are around that size, because that is how big you were supposed to be if you wanted to be able to have a daito in a castle. So that's one of the limits. There's a couple of other size limits. In 1645, the legal limit for katana altogether was all the way up to 2 shaku, 8 or 9 sun, which is all the way up to 84 to 88 centimeters or so. So you can see that that's beyond the range that we have represented here. So anything in here would fall within that that maximum limit for what size katana you could have. The tachi, by comparison, is what we would call left-tailed. It's not quite distributed the same way. So there's many fewer represented in the, let's say, between 69 centimeters and lower, and most of them are higher than this. So if we had a larger sample size, it's possible this would start to look normally distributed, and then it would start to occupy a mean or an average in a slightly higher group than the uchigatana, maybe around 75 centimeters, 76 centimeters, 77 centimeters. So possibly the peak would start to show up, and it would start to show up a little bit higher than uchigatana. As it stands right now, the peak is still around 69 to 72 centimeters, but with higher representation in the upper these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 heptiles that we have in the number 1 and 2 heptiles. They have a larger fractional representation. So that's a lot of statistical speak. What can we say at the end of this? So we don't know exactly from what periods these swords were measured. We do know that these were all uncut, unbroken swords, so it's not like we had a giant tachi that was shortened to represent a shorter tachi, and same is true for katana. But we do have a lot of swords that we can look at, and we can see that sometimes they made a tachi that was rather small, and sometimes they made an uchigatana that was quite large. Again, he mentioned that he's seen uchigatana at times that have been 85 centimeters. The largest one that the author's personally seen has been 92 centimeters in blade length for a katana, not a tachi. However, in general, tachi are distributed in such a way that they tend to be a little bit longer than katana. So right now there is showing a bit of a statistical difference between the two, but it's very small. This is something like if you were to look at plastic silverware, you'd say that on averages, if we looked at a whole bunch of different sets, plastic knives might be longer than plastic forks. But sometimes they're about the same size, and sometimes the plastic forks are longer than the plastic knives. So it's something that would only show up when you have very large numbers to compare with. So it's really good information that's provided, and something else to look at. Can you have a katana that's bigger than a tachi? Yes. Were tachi bigger than uchigatana? Certainly, and I think that if we broke these down by what period they were in, that it would be even more obvious, as traditionally uchigatana were even shorter prior to the Edo period. So very interesting information from Touken World, and once again, thanks to Gunsen History for bringing it to our attention. All right, until next time, stay frosty, everyone. Take care.